The daughter of a wealthy man drowns in the pool. The rescuers try to save her but fail. However, when the driver arrives, he takes an unexpected action that shocks everyone. The mansion was stunning, with imposing white marble facades and large windows reflecting the golden lights of the party. Soft music filled the air as elegant waiters moved among the guests with champagne glasses in hand. The garden, meticulously decorated with exotic flowers and lit by candles, offered a charming contrast to the sophisticated glow of the halls. It was a party meant to impress, but Isabella felt detached from it all, as if the world around her were a beautiful painting she didn't belong to. She was the center of attention, but not by choice. Dressed in an elegant blue silk dress that accentuated her slender figure and intensely green eyes, Isabella looked like a princess at her own party. Yet, there was something in her gaze that clashed with the opulence around her. She smiled, exchanging pleasantries and brief conversations with the guests, but her thoughts were distant. She observed the empty smiles and trivial conversations around her, feeling only a void that the party couldn't fill. The guests, a mix of prominent business figures and socialites, approached her with polite greetings and rehearsed phrases. She maintained impeccable posture, responding courteously, but her mind wandered. As she exchanged glances with strangers, she wondered why her presence seemed so important to them when she barely cared. This was her parents' world, a universe of appearances and formalities, where Isabella always felt like an outsider. Among the guests, her parents stood out. Her father, always busy, moved around the hall with an almost intimidating seriousness, nodding slightly at guests. Her mother, dressed in a flawless red gown, laughed and gestured as she talked but never looked at Isabella. It seemed as though they were there more to display their achievements than to celebrate as a family. Isabella wondered how many of these guests truly knew her essence. Probably none. At one point, one of her mother's friends approached, praising Isabella with almost forced enthusiasm. "You look enchanting, dear. It must be so wonderful to have all this, right?" Isabella smiled, thanking her, but something in her chest tightened. She had everything money could buy, yes, but even so, she felt a longing for something she couldn't name. Something none of these compliments or expensive gifts seemed to fulfill. Watching her parents conversing in the distance, Isabella felt a pang of sadness. She was never sure who they really were when they were out of the spotlight. To the public, they seemed perfect, but at home, the silences were as frequent as the luxurious furniture. Isabella wondered what it would be like to be seen for who she truly was, not as the daughter of a powerful businessman or the beautiful young woman at the party, but as someone longing for a genuine connection. Her mind drifted to memories of Miguel, the family driver, the only one who seemed to see her beyond appearances. He always had a kind word, a joke, or wise advice, things her parents rarely offered. Sometimes, Isabella wished he were there at the party by her side, bringing her the comfort that only he seemed capable of providing. But she knew that was a foolish fantasy. In that environment, there would be no place for Miguel. Time seemed to drag on, and Isabella couldn't see any meaning in all the pomp. She felt trapped in a glass box where everything around her was beautiful and shiny but cold and empty. She turned away from the guests, observing the details of the decor as if they were strangers to her. Every flower, every light, everything was planned to impress, but Isabella longed for something real, something that could touch her soul. Deep down, she knew she needed something that none of these guests could offer. An authentic gesture, a word not said just out of politeness. Isabella sighed, feeling lonelier than ever. The party continued. Laughter and music muffled her thoughts, but something inside her seemed to be crying out for freedom. As the night wore on and Isabella grew increasingly exhausted with the environment around her, she decided to escape the party. With light steps, she slid through the crowd and, unnoticed, made her way to the garden. The mansion seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as she moved away from the laughter and music. The pool, surrounded by palm trees and soft lights, awaited her as a silent refuge, far from curious eyes and empty words. She sighed, trying to find herself in that momentary solitude. Approaching the edge, Isabella observed her distorted reflection on the water's surface. The image seemed like that of another person, someone she barely recognized. With her gaze fixed, she tried to dissipate the sadness that lingered around her. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and for a moment, forgot everything. There, in that brief instant, she felt free. But the silence didn't last long. A subtle noise, like a whisper, made her open her eyes, and suddenly her body lost balance. The accident happened too quickly for anyone to notice. Isabella felt the cold water around her, and time seemed to freeze. Her mind wandered between fragments of memories and confused feelings as she sank, unable to react. The water, once inviting, now seemed to pull her with irresistible force. Her body surrendered to the liquid darkness, and for a moment she thought that perhaps she would finally find peace there. Inside the house, the party continued, oblivious to what was happening outside. But, as if drawn by a premonition, one of the guests noticed Isabella's absence and began to search for her. Approaching the pool, he noticed something strange and, in a mixture of shock and horror, cried out desperately. The cry pierced the mansion walls, interrupting some conversations and provoking a sudden silence. Within seconds, everyone rushed toward the sound, driven by urgency and fear. The scene was distressing. Isabella was floating motionless in the water, her hair floating around her like a tragic crown. Some guests hesitated, unsure of what to do, while others screamed for help. The water seemed cold and threatening, enveloped in a sepulchral silence. No one dared to enter, as if the pool had become an unfathomable abyss. The air filled with murmurs and looks of despair as everyone tried to understand what had happened. Finally, one of the mansion's security guards dived into the water, bringing Isabella out. Her skin was pale, and her closed eyes seemed to seal some deep secret. One of the guests tried to check her pulse but soon shook his head, apprehensive. The tension in the air was so palpable that no one dared to breathe, as if fearing to break the fragile thread that might still link Isabella to life. A circle of people formed around the pool, all in shock, unsure of how to react. Some murmured prayers while others just watched, paralyzed. The golden lights that once adorned the mansion now seemed somber, casting restless shadows on distressed faces. No one expected that the party, planned to be a moment of celebration, would turn into a nightmare scene. Isabella's mother appeared among the guests, her eyes wide and hands trembling. She approached her daughter's body but hesitated, unable to believe what she was seeing. The mansion, which until then had been a stage of luxury and joy, now seemed like a dark prison where the worst of nightmares had materialized. Isabella's father, beside her, remained rigid, as if the gravity of the situation was too heavy to process. As the minutes passed, the despair increased. Everyone there was united by a single question. How could this have happened? Isabella, who moments earlier had been the embodiment of beauty and youth, now lay motionless, like a memory frozen in time. The night, which promised to be unforgettable, indeed would be, but for reasons no one could have anticipated. Rescuers arrived quickly, moving with precision and urgency. Equipped with defibrillators and first aid kits, they took control of the situation, pushing back the curious ones who insisted on approaching. The tension in the air was thick. Each second seemed to drag as the rescuers worked without pause. Their skilled hands searched for signs of life in Isabella, but her body remained motionless, indifferent to any stimulus. The muffled sound of the resuscitation device echoed in the air, like a final plea for hope. The guests watched in silence, some whispering prayers, others remaining in a near-paralyzing state of shock. Expressions of disbelief and fear dominated their faces, each one captured by a growing dread. Isabella, the young woman who seemed to have the world at her feet, now lay there, vulnerable and pale, a tragic reminder that even the most protected can be snatched away in an instant. Life seemed to hang by an invisible thread, oscillating between presence and oblivion. As the rescuers tried to revive her, time seemed to stretch. Isabella's mother, once elegant and haughty, was unrecognizable. Her eyes red with tears, her face pale and distorted by pain, she clutched her hands to her chest, unable to contain her sobs. Each failed attempt at resuscitation made her feel as if she was sinking further into despair, as if her very soul was escaping along with her daughter's life. In contrast, Isabella's father remained motionless, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and horror. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, as if his will could reverse what was happening. Inside, it was as if his world had collapsed, but he didn't allow his emotions to show. He stood rigid, fists clenched, struggling to accept the inconceivable, that the young woman he had always believed to be untouchable was there, between life and death. The rescue team exchanged apprehensive looks, their faces somber, revealing what everyone there feared. The team leader made a discreet signal to his colleague, suggesting that perhaps it was time to accept the inevitable. But no one dared to speak the words, no one wanted to be the first to declare that it was too late. The rescuers' hands moved slower, as if they too, for a brief moment, had allowed themselves to feel the loss that seemed inevitable. Finally, after numerous attempts, the rescue team leader sighed, withdrawing his hands from Isabella's body. He gazed at the anxious faces around him, and in that deafening silence, everything became clear. Isabella's mother fell to her knees beside her daughter, her cries echoing in the air. It was a sound that cut to the heart, a deep lament that no comfort could calm. She reached out to touch Isabella's face but hesitated, fearing that touch might confirm the harsh reality. The father, still standing, now looked at the ground, his shoulders heavy, as if crushed by an unbearable burden. He couldn't accept it, couldn't bear to accept it. All the plans, all the dreams, everything was unraveling before his eyes. He approached his wife, touching her shoulder, but both were lost in their own pains, unable to find solace in one another. The guests surrounding the scene now looked at each other, speechless, sharing a collective feeling of helplessness. It was as if a cold void had invaded the environment, erasing all the joy that had just filled the mansion. Some began to withdraw, respecting the family's grief, while others remained, unable to take their eyes off the desolate scene. No one knew what to do or say, and the weight of that uncertainty hung over everyone, a burden they seemed to carry together. The leader of the medical team, even after ending the procedures, stood for another moment, perhaps waiting for a miracle, something that could defy the odds. But all that remained was the silence, profound and overwhelming. The night, which had begun with promises of happiness, now became a stage of anguish and loss. From outside the commotion, Miguel watched everything in silence. The family's driver, a man of robust appearance and serene expression, looked strange in that environment of sophistication and luxury. He wore a simple, discreet suit that contrasted with the luxurious outfits of the guests. But his eyes were fixed on Isabella, and a fierce determination shone in his gaze. Miguel had always been reserved, but at that moment something had changed. He knew he needed to act. Miguel and Isabella had a bond that transcended the formal relationship between employer and employee. He had watched her grow, always attentive to moments when she seemed lost or lonely. Many times, he had offered her words of comfort or simple smiles when her parents were not around. And she, even amidst that life of excess and appearances, knew she could trust him. Now, seeing her there, fragile and defenseless, Miguel didn't hesitate. He approached the rescuers with firm steps, driven by an urgency that seemed to arise from a deep place. As he drew closer, his eyes captured every detail of Isabella's pale face, and the pain in his chest grew. One of the rescuers tried to stop him, but Miguel, with a resolute look, made a gesture that left no room for discussion. Something in his posture showed that he would not accept a no as an answer. People around him whispered, intrigued by Miguel's presence. Some recognized him as the family driver, but no one could understand why he was approaching as if it were his right. His movements were precise and assured, and any hesitation had vanished from his demeanor. To him, the opinion of no one there mattered. What truly mattered was Isabella and what he needed to do for her. A tense silence settled as Miguel knelt beside her, feeling the weight of the situation and the expectation of the eyes fixed on him. His thoughts wandered quickly to the past, to moments when he had learned the techniques he was now about to use. Miguel took a deep breath, his eyes closed for an instant, as if searching within himself for the strength needed for what was to come. His presence there, determined and unwavering, brought a new energy to the environment. Isabella's father watched the scene, incredulous. To him, Miguel had always been a mere driver, someone he rarely remembered. Seeing that man now so close to his daughter left him unsettled. He felt torn between the urgency to protect Isabella and the strangeness of seeing someone so far outside the familiar context assuming a role he never imagined. But Miguel ignored the looks and doubts. His focus was entirely on Isabella. Miguel knew Isabella better than anyone there. He knew of her joys and her sorrows, of the long afternoons when he found her sitting in the garden, lost in thought. He had always been a silent observer of her life, but at that moment, silence was not enough. He felt it was his duty like never before to protect her. And although he knew his interference might be questioned, he was ready to face anything that came. Isabella's mother, still in shock, gazed at Miguel with desperate eyes. There was something about him that made her believe. Perhaps it was the determination he exuded, or the almost paternal care with which he touched her. Miguel was, after all, more than just a driver. He had been a silent confidant, someone who had always been around in difficult times. And now, as he acted with almost surgical precision, she felt a glimmer of hope, even if it was fragile and tenuous. The surrounding environment seemed suspended as if time had stopped to observe Miguel and his act of courage. The mansion's lights, once so bright and intense, now became distant witnesses to an intimate and dramatic scene. And as he began the procedures, a collective sigh of hope and fear emanated from those around him. Deep down, everyone knew that, regardless of the outcome, that moment would change their lives forever. Miguel positioned his hands firmly over Isabella's chest, his eyes closed as if accessing an ancient memory hidden in his mind. The technique he was about to apply was not something he had learned through conventional means. It was born from a past shrouded in mysteries he rarely mentioned. His movements were precise, almost instinctive, each pressure and pause following an almost ritualistic rhythm. The audience watched in astonishment, captivated by the tension of that moment that seemed to defy reality. He murmured barely audible words as if reciting a prayer or evoking something deep within him. Each passing second felt like an entire universe of anticipation as he alternated between compressions and breaths, trying to bring life back to the young woman who meant so much to him. The rescuers who had given up now watched without interfering, captivated by that unexpected and brave act. The very air around seemed to vibrate with Miguel's urgency. The guests, initially ready to interrupt him, remained silent, enveloped by a mixture of skepticism and hope. Some seemed to believe that he, with his firm hands and resolute eyes, could indeed bring Isabella back. Her father, still paralyzed by shock, watched Miguel with a mixture of disbelief and apprehension, torn between hope and the fear of losing his daughter forever. Miguel continued the procedure, his hands moving as if following a rhythm only he could hear. The technique was unusual, with precise touches and measured breaths, something that seemed almost mystical. In his eyes, there was a glimmer of desperation and conviction, a fire that no one there understood but that everyone could feel. It was as if he were channeling every bit of energy he possessed, determined not to give up until Isabella responded. Time, once suspended, seemed to run in slow motion. Each of Miguel's movements, each gesture, seemed infused with an overwhelming urgency. Those around him barely breathed, fearing that any sound might shatter the fragile hope taking shape. Miguel pressed Isabella's chest one more time, then paused, looking at her with a mixture of supplication and determination, as if commanding life itself to return. Suddenly, a slight spasm ran through Isabella's body, almost imperceptible but enough to elicit gasps of surprise from the crowd around. Miguel leaned in again, applying a final pressure, and then, as if obeying his will, Isabella emitted a fragile and hesitant breath. The sound was so faint that it seemed to dissolve into the air, but it was unmistakable. Miguel moved back slightly, keeping his gaze fixed on her, waiting to see if life would truly return. The profound silence that followed was broken by the sound of Isabella's irregular breathing, a struggle between fragility and the strength that tried to return. The onlookers' eyes filled with tears, many covering their mouths in disbelief. Isabella's mother, who was nearby, let out a sob mixed with relief as she clung to her husband's arm, too weak to stand. Everyone was mesmerized by that unlikely revival. Miguel, however, did not allow emotion to overwhelm him. He maintained his composure, attentive to every movement of Isabella, monitoring her like an unyielding guardian. Inside, a current of relief and gratitude mingled with a deep sense of connection, as if that moment encapsulated all the reasons he was there. Her breathing gradually stabilized, and the miracle of his persistence now became real, visible, undeniable. When he finally realized what had happened, the environment around Miguel began to take shape again. The guests' expressions, Isabella's parents' restrained sobs, and the murmurs of disbelief. But to him, none of that mattered as much as the gentle rise and fall of Isabella's chest. Isabella opened her eyes slowly as if emerging from a distant dream. The light around her was dazzling, and the world seemed to float in a misty haze. She blinked several times until her eyes met Miguel's face, watching her with an almost disconcerting intensity. There was something in that gaze that made her feel safe even if confused. She didn't understand how, but she knew he was there for her, as he always had been, silent and protective. Miguel said nothing. His eyes, full of restrained emotion, reflected a deep relief and something more, something he kept hidden within. Isabella felt a wave of gratitude and recognition. It was as if he were the anchor that brought her back to reality. She tried to smile, but the effort was almost imperceptible. Even so, Miguel noticed and responded with a slight nod, confirming he was there as always for whatever she needed. Time seemed suspended between them. Amid the chaos and noise of voices around, there existed a private silence that enveloped only the two of them. Miguel held Isabella's hand briefly, and in that touch, there was an exchange of unspoken emotions, a silent understanding. She felt that Miguel carried a secret, something he dared not verbalize, but that lingered between them like an invisible presence. As she regained consciousness, Isabella observed Miguel with a mixture of curiosity and familiarity. He was more than the family's driver. To her, he had always been a constant presence, someone who understood what others never attempted to understand. And now, looking into his eyes, Isabella felt strangely connected, as if he held answers she didn't even know she sought. Around them, murmurs began to re-emerge. Guests and rescuers, astonished, looked at Miguel and Isabella, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Incredulity was written on the faces around, but Isabella's focus remained on Miguel. For a moment she felt vulnerable and exposed, but his presence beside her gave her a strength she didn't even know she had. Isabella's father approached slowly, hesitating as he saw the connection between his daughter and the driver. Miguel's gaze, now more resolute, met his briefly, but there were no words. This was something none of them could explain with logic, a connection that transcended the understanding of others. The father seemed disoriented, torn between gratitude and discomfort at seeing Miguel in a role he himself had never been able to fulfill. Noticing Isabella's parents' approach, Miguel gently released her hand and took a step back as if returning her to them. Even so, the bond established between him and Isabella remained, though in silence. She felt his absence as a loss, but knew that Miguel wasn't truly stepping away. He was there, even at a distance, ready to protect her. She wished to know more about him, about the origin of that strength that had just saved her. The guests, now recovering from the initial shock, exchanged glances and whispers, still trying to process what they had witnessed. They seemed confused, as if they had seen something beyond comprehension. But Isabella ignored everything around her. Her eyes repeatedly turned to Miguel, who remained attentive like a guardian. She knew the explanations would come later, but for now all that mattered was that he was there. Finally, as the rescuers prepared a stretcher for Isabella, she cast a last glance at Miguel, a look that expressed both a question and a thank you. He looked back at her, with a softness that contrasted with his usual reserve, letting out an almost imperceptible smile. And at that moment, Isabella knew that even without words, they had shared a secret that would change their lives forever. The atmosphere in the living room was filled with tension and confusion. Isabella lay on a sofa, still fragile, but with a rosy color beginning to return to her face. Her parents, seated close to her, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Miguel stood a bit apart, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture calm but his gaze alert. He knew that explanations would be demanded, and he was prepared to face them. Isabella's father was the first to break the silence. With a tone mixing relief and suspicion, he addressed Miguel. "What exactly did you do out there, Miguel? And how did you know what to do?" His voice was firm, but behind that rigid facade, it was clear he felt lost. He had never imagined that the driver, a man he barely knew, would possess any skill that could save his daughter's life. The layers of distrust were hard to hide. Miguel took a deep breath, carefully measuring his words before responding. "I learned this technique many years ago in a very different context from what we know today. I never imagined I'd use it one day, but I knew I had to try." He spoke with a sincerity that made him even more intriguing. It was as if a piece of his past, which he had kept hidden, was beginning to emerge. However, his eyes remained downcast, avoiding any direct confrontation. Isabella's mother remained silent, her gaze fixed on some point in the room. She avoided looking directly at Miguel, and a slight tremor in her hands betrayed the nervousness that dominated her. Something about his presence seemed to disturb her deeply, as if his words were a reminder of something she preferred to forget. She limited herself to squeezing her daughter's hand, almost as if seeking to anchor herself in the feeling that Isabella was alive, not wanting to get lost in questions that could bring more pain. Sitting in the armchair nearby, Isabella's father seemed even more uncomfortable. On one hand, he felt genuine gratitude for what Miguel had done. On the other, he couldn't understand how a simple driver had such specific knowledge, something the rescuers themselves had not been able to achieve. Miguel seemed to represent a break from everything he believed he knew about the people around him, and it left him feeling vulnerable. "Thank you for what you did for my daughter," the father said, his tone almost devoid of emotion. "But I would like to know how someone in your position learned something like this." Miguel raised his gaze, and for a brief moment their eyes met. It was a look laden with something deeper than words could express, a silent confrontation between different worlds. Miguel knew that any explanation would be incomplete, but he still felt obliged to respond. "I've lived through many things, sir. Not everything is as it seems." Miguel said this with a calm that seemed to defy the tension in the room. There was a depth to his voice, as if he were speaking not only to Isabella's father but to everyone in that room. He knew that his past was a mosaic of secrets and experiences that no one there could understand, and that no matter how hard they tried, they would never see him completely. Isabella, feeling the weight of the moment, extended her hand toward Miguel, though she was too weak to stand. He approached slowly, stopping a short distance away but without touching her. It was a small gesture but one overflowing with meaning. The connection they shared was palpable, and at that moment, none of the others could ignore the intimacy that seemed to surround them. She didn't need answers. She knew that what Miguel had done was for her, and that was enough. Finally, Isabella's mother stood up from the sofa and walked away without saying a word, heading to a window. She looked out at the garden where it had all happened, as if trying to process what she had witnessed. Something about Miguel, about his presence and his gaze, seemed to awaken a whirlwind of feelings in her. In silence, she tried to order her thoughts, while Miguel's figure remained like a shadow from a past she preferred to leave buried. As Miguel stood there in the living room, the weight of the past caught up to him overwhelmingly. He glanced at Isabella's mother briefly, recalling a time when life seemed full of possibilities. He had loved that woman with an intensity that still haunted him. A love he never imagined he would have to abandon but was forced to leave behind. She, who had once meant everything to him, now seemed like a stranger, keeping herself cold and distant. Yet Miguel knew that beneath that veil of indifference, she too carried the weight of that secret. Years ago, when he and Isabella's mother met, the connection between them had been immediate and undeniable. Their love was born during a hot summer, amidst furtive meetings and moonlit whispers. The intensity of that romance had consumed them completely, and they had made promises that now seemed like dreams from a forgotten time. Back then, their world seemed immense and invincible, but reality had taken care of showing that not all loves could withstand the pressures of fate. Miguel remembered an afternoon when, under the shade of a tree in the garden, they had made plans to escape together. She had confided in him that she felt suffocated by the life she led, by the social commitments and the expectations imposed by her family. He believed they could build something together, far from all that. But reality was cruel, and he soon realized that the price of going forward would be devastating for both of them, especially for her, tied to a world he could never reach. That was when the decision to leave took shape, painful and inevitable. Miguel knew that if he stayed, he would end up destroying everything she had built. More than that, he wanted to protect her, to preserve the image of the perfect mother and wife she maintained before the world. He had never told her how much it hurt to have to abandon her, but at that moment he felt it was the only option. He left, taking with him not only the love they had but also a piece of himself. Miguel's return to that house was both a reunion and a reminder of all he had lost. Every time he looked at Isabella, he felt a whirlwind of emotions because she was the product of a past that no one there should ever discover. However, over the years he had found ways to stay close to her, to be a silent and protective presence, even though the world would never know their true relationship. He was there when Isabella took her first steps and later when she faced the loneliness imposed by the emotional absence of her parents. Keeping that secret was not only a way to protect the young woman but also a sacrifice he was willing to make to ensure she could grow up without the weight of a scandal. He knew that Isabella could never find out that the man she called father was not her true progenitor and that the mother who loved her so dearly had a past that now had to remain hidden. For him, this meant bearing the pain in silence, being the protector in the shadows. Sometimes he wondered how things would have been different if he had had the courage to fight for that love and claim his place in Isabella's life. But the fear of what could happen to her kept him silent. He had accepted his role as an observer, as an invisible guardian, satisfied only to see that she was well, that she had everything she needed, even if she didn't know the truth. Still, every time Isabella looked at him with those eyes full of questions, he felt the weight of the secret and the responsibility to keep her safe. Miguel allowed himself one last glance at Isabella's mother, who still had her back turned to him. Even without words, he knew that both shared a silent understanding of what they had lived. It was a tacit agreement. He would never reveal what had happened, and she would continue maintaining her position, her facade. This way both could pretend that those days were just shadows of a distant time. However, he knew the past would never cease to be part of them, like a scar that would never disappear. Isabella, sitting on the couch and unaware of the thoughts unfolding around her, was the living embodiment of the love they had shared. In his silence, Miguel vowed to himself that he would do anything to protect her. He knew that this was the only way to honor the love he once had. The next morning, Isabella found Miguel in the garden, in a secluded corner where the rose bushes created a natural barrier, shielding them from prying eyes. She approached in silence, her heart beating faster at his presence. There was something about Miguel that she couldn't explain, a sense of security that made her feel at home. Without understanding why, she felt an uncontrollable urge to open up, to share something of herself. Miguel noticed her approach and, with a slight smile, indicated for her to sit beside him. The two remained silent for a few moments, just listening to the distant birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Isabella hesitated before speaking, but finally broke the silence. "I feel like there's something between us," she said softly, not expecting an immediate response. Something I can't explain, but that seems to have always been there. Miguel looked at her, his expression mixing surprise and emotion. He wanted to tell her so many things, but he knew he couldn't. Still, the desire to protect her was stronger than any secret he held. "I feel the same way, Isabella," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I've always been here for you. Even when you didn't notice, I was watching and I cared." She smiled, realizing that, in some way, Miguel had always been her silent guardian. Feeling more at ease, Isabella began to talk about her feelings, about the loneliness she experienced even when surrounded by so many people. She told him about the nights when she felt isolated, as if the world around her was made of shadows. Miguel listened attentively, without interrupting, absorbing every word with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time. And though he was struggling with the pain of not being able to tell her the whole truth, he knew that moment was important for both of them. "You always seem to know what I need," she confessed, lightly touching Miguel's hand. "It's as if you're part of my family in a way I've never felt with others." Miguel felt the warmth of her hand, and a wave of tenderness and sadness washed over him. He wanted to tell her everything, but he knew that the truth could be a burden for her. Instead, he just held her hand and squeezed it gently, trying to convey how much he cared even without words. Miguel knew he was approaching a dangerous limit. The more Isabella opened up, the more he felt the weight of the secret he kept. However, he couldn't pull away. The connection between them was too strong, something even he couldn't fully explain. And as Isabella confided her deepest thoughts, he knew he was risking everything, but that he couldn't abandon her. Isabella's eyes shone with a trust that moved him. "Promise you won't leave, Miguel? I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I need you close." Miguel swallowed hard, feeling the impact of those words. He wanted to promise her the world, but knew his presence could bring truths to light that she wasn't prepared to face. Even so, he nodded, knowing he could never deny her that request. Miguel spoke of his own struggles, subtly but sincerely. "Life sometimes forces us to make tough decisions, Isabella. But no matter what, I'll always be where you need me to be." He knew that each word was true, but he also knew that at any moment, his secret could explode like a bomb, destroying everything they had built in that instant. They stayed there in silence for a few more moments, each absorbing the other's presence. Isabella finally stood up, but not before casting him one last look full of gratitude and something more, something she might not even understand herself. Miguel watched her as she walked away, feeling the weight of the unspoken promise between them. Deep down, he knew that, from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. Isabella's father waited for Miguel in the library, a spacious and austere room, filled with books on shelves that reached the ceiling. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the garden where Miguel and Isabella had talked earlier. His gaze was hard and focused, but there was something in his posture that revealed a contained nervousness. When Miguel entered, he turned slowly, measuring every word he was about to say. "Miguel, we need to talk," said Isabella's father, his voice laced with calculated coldness. "I can see that there's something going on between you and my daughter, something that goes beyond simple cordiality." Miguel closed the door behind him and remained calm, knowing this moment was inevitable. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of the confrontation. As much as he wanted to keep the secret, he knew he could no longer avoid the truth. "Sir," Miguel began, carefully choosing his words, "the truth is more complex than you can imagine." He hesitated for a moment, but as he looked into the man's eyes, he realized there was no turning back. "I never intended to get close to her this way, but Isabella is my daughter. She always has been, long before you ever met her." The silence that followed was thick and almost tangible, as if the air around them had stopped. Isabella's father's eyes widened, his disbelief quickly transforming into rage. He stepped forward, his voice almost a whisper but filled with fury. "That's impossible, Miguel. How dare you bring something like this up?" His mind seemed to search for a way out, an explanation that would disprove what he had just heard. But the certainty in Miguel's gaze made him understand that this was no invention or whim. It was a truth he had never expected to face. Miguel, maintaining his composure, spoke firmly, "I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. Isabella was born from a love that your wife and I shared before she married you. When our relationship ended, I decided to step aside. Everything I've done since then was out of respect for the family she built and for Isabella's well-being." Miguel watched the man's reaction, expecting an outburst, but what he found was a look of mixed hurt and bewilderment. After a few moments, Isabella's father took a step back, leaning on the table behind him, as if needing support to process the revelation. He ran his hands over his face, trying to find the right words. Isabella, she doesn't know anything, does she? He asked, his voice now weak, almost a murmur. Miguel shook his head, confirming that, for the young woman, everything remained hidden, untouched by that truth. What do you intend to do now? He asked, his voice reflecting both disappointment and resignation. Miguel, his gaze fixed on the ground, took a deep breath before answering. Nothing. My intention was never to disturb Isabella's life. I just wanted to be close to protect her, to watch her grow. I have no right to interfere more than that. The sincerity in his words touched Isabella's father, who looked at him with a mix of respect and reluctance. After a long pause, Isabella's father straightened, regaining his posture. This truth cannot come to light, Miguel. If it's discovered, it will destroy everything. My wife, my daughter, our family. Miguel nodded in agreement, feeling the same responsibility and burden that Isabella's father expressed. He knew that this truth would have to be buried, no matter how painful it was. Isabella's life and everything she knew about the world depended on that silent pact. The two men exchanged a final look, an unspoken understanding that this secret would remain hidden between them. Isabella's father extended his hand, a formal gesture, but also a silent promise that he would keep that truth sealed. Miguel shook his hand, accepting the agreement, but knowing that, from that moment on, things would never be the same. In the early morning hours, Miguel packed his belongings calmly. The soft shadows of the furniture in his small house next to the mansion were cast against the walls as he folded his clothes and placed a few personal items into his suitcase. He knew that, for Isabella's sake, leaving was the only option. There was no longer any space for him there, especially now that her father knew the truth. He felt torn between the need to protect her and the pain of leaving her without a proper explanation. As he closed his suitcase, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway, and when he turned, he found Isabella standing at the door. Her eyes were swollen, and she wore an expression of pleading that touched him deeply. "You're not leaving, are you?" she asked, her voice fragile and broken. Miguel felt his heart tighten. This was the scene he had feared the most. He had never imagined that the farewell would be so painful, much less that Isabella would notice his departure so soon. Taking a deep breath, Miguel tried to maintain his composure. "I have to go, Isabella. My time here has ended." He forced a smile, but his words were heavy with sadness. Isabella, however, took a step forward, her eyes fixed on him. "Please don't go. I don't know why, but I feel like I can't lose you now. You've always been here for me, Miguel. I don't know how things would be without you." He lowered his eyes, feeling helpless in the face of her plea. He wished he could tell her the truth, explain why he cared so much and why he never wanted to leave. But he knew he could never do that. "Isabella," he began, his voice soft and hesitant, "I'll always be nearby even if you can't see me. Whenever you need me, I'll be closer than you think." She didn't understand, but his words had the effect of a promise, something she could carry with her. Isabella hugged him, and Miguel, surprised, took a moment before returning the embrace. He felt her warmth and fragility as if he were holding his own daughter, something he was but could never be acknowledged as. He closed his eyes, absorbing that moment, knowing it might be the last time he would have the chance to hold her so close. That embrace was all he needed to carry with him as he went on his way. He gently let her go, looking into her eyes one last time. "You're strong, Isabella. I know you'll find your path and be happy." She tried to smile, but the tears in her eyes betrayed her. "Please, Miguel, don't forget us." He nodded, holding her gaze for another moment, committing every detail of that face he loved so much to memory. There was a world of unspoken words between them, but he knew the farewell needed to be brief. When Isabella left the room, Miguel picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. With each step, he felt heavier, as if something were trying to hold him back. When he reached the exit, he looked back at the mansion one last time, where so many memories had been built. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of weakness before moving forward. He knew this was a final goodbye, but he promised himself that, in some way, he would always be near to protect her, even from afar. The night was cold and silent, but Miguel found solace in thinking that his absence might, perhaps, give Isabella and her family a chance to reconcile. He knew his departure would leave a void, but he believed that, without his constant presence, Isabella might finally grow closer to her father and build a relationship with him. Leaving her life was, for Miguel, the greatest proof of love he could offer. And so, with his suitcase in hand and a heavy heart, Miguel departed. Each step took him further from that house, from the life he had wanted to be part of. But the love he felt for Isabella, a silent and unconditional love, gave him the strength to move on. Deep within his soul, he knew that, no matter how far he went, he would never cease to be a part of her. With Miguel's departure, the silence that filled the mansion became even heavier, almost suffocating. Isabella's father spent hours in his study, surrounded by papers and memories of a past that now seemed distant. As he looked at photos of Isabella from different stages of her life, he felt the weight of his own failings. For perhaps the first time he realized how much he had been absent. Between his responsibilities as a businessman and his relentless pursuit of success, he had neglected the most important people in his life. The image of Miguel haunted him, not out of distrust or resentment, but as an example of what he himself had not been. It was a stranger who, in the end, had shown Isabella the love and support that he, as a father, should have provided. This recognition pained him deeply, but he also felt that, with Miguel's departure, he had gained a new opportunity. He decided it was time to change, to become the father and husband his family deserved. Finding his wife in the living room, he felt a surge of regret that he had ignored for so long. She, with a distant look, seemed to carry a sadness he had never bothered to understand. He approached, sitting beside her and holding her hands for the first time in many years. "I'm sorry for everything," he murmured, feeling the fragility of the connection that had once been strong. She didn't respond immediately, but a sad smile appeared on her lips, and he knew that finally they were ready to start anew. In the days that followed, there were tentative attempts at rapprochement between them. Isabella, still coping with Miguel's sudden absence, spent more time at home, and her father invited her on walks through the garden, something they had never done together. Initially, their conversations were brief and hesitant, but he was determined to get to know her better, to understand the dreams and hopes he had once overlooked while absorbed in his work. Each small detail Isabella shared about herself was a step toward bridging the chasm that separated them. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, Isabella mentioned Miguel, her eyes reflecting a silent sadness. "He was always like a father to me," she confessed, almost in a whisper. Her father felt a pang of pain hearing those words, but he decided he would no longer hide the truth. "You know, Isabella," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "I miss him too. But maybe now we can find a new beginning. I want to be by your side just as he always was." She looked at him, surprised, and for the first time felt sincerity in his gaze. Gradually, Isabella began to trust her father more, and he in turn became increasingly present. They started sharing stories, talking about what made them happy and what worried them. He discovered, with admiration, that Isabella was much stronger than he had imagined, and that her sensitivity was one of her most beautiful qualities. He felt immense gratitude for having been given this second chance to redeem himself, to finally be there for his daughter and his wife. With his wife, the conversations also grew more sincere. He began to understand how much she had suffered in silence while he was absorbed in his world. With patience and care, he sought to reconnect, listening to her feelings and sharing his own. For the first time in many years, they allowed themselves to be vulnerable with each other. Gradually, they rediscovered a love they had believed was lost forever. As the days passed, the house, once cold and distant, began to fill with laughter and conversations. Isabella and her father developed a closeness that both felt had been denied to them for too long. Her father, in turn, became a more attentive, more present man, aware of the value of each moment with his family. Miguel's absence was still felt, but there was a new hope in the air, a sense that, together, they could build something stronger and more genuine. In that family reunion, Isabella's father felt that, finally, he was at peace with himself. He knew there was still much to be done, many steps to take, but the path was clear. And with Isabella and his wife by his side, he felt there was nothing left to fear. He was, at last, ready to honor the promise he had made to himself and to those he loved most. And that night, as they walked together through the mansion, they all felt that a new beginning lay before them, something more solid and sincere than they had ever experienced before. After weeks of reconciliation and slow family rebuilding, Isabella's father made an unexpected decision. He invited Miguel to return. He realized that Miguel was an essential piece for his daughter's peace and well-being. The presence he had once mistrusted and even dismissed now seemed indispensable, and his heart opened to accept the man who had done so much for his family. As he extended the invitation, his words were simple but filled with respect and gratitude. "Miguel, we need you here." Not as an employee but as part of the family, Miguel received the invitation with surprise and emotion. He hadn't expected to return, much less to be welcomed as family. When he arrived at the mansion, Isabella ran to meet him with a smile on her lips and tears in her eyes. Without hesitation, she embraced him tightly, feeling that, for the first time, everything seemed to fall into place. Her father, watching the scene, allowed a discreet smile to escape, understanding that Miguel's presence was what Isabella had always needed. On a sunny afternoon, the family gathered in the living room, and Isabella's father asked Miguel to sit beside him. With a look of approval and encouragement, he indicated that there was something to be said, something that had been hidden for too long. Isabella, curious, looked from one to the other, sensing that there was tension in the air but not understanding what was about to happen. She never imagined her life was about to change forever. Taking a deep breath, Isabella's father began to speak. "Isabella, there's something you need to know. For your entire life, we believed that certain truths should remain unspoken. But today, I know you deserve the truth no matter how difficult it is." He paused, and holding her hand, he looked at Miguel. "Miguel is more than a friend, more than someone who's always looked after you. He is your biological father." The world seemed to stop for Isabella. She looked at Miguel, expecting to see denial, but all she found was a gentle look, full of love and sadness. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she tried to process what she had just heard. She felt a wave of emotions: shock, disbelief, and above all, a sense of acceptance she hadn't realized was there, waiting to be found. Miguel, his eyes welling up, tried to explain. "I never wanted to leave you, Isabella. From the day you were born, I was nearby, trying to protect you in the best way I could, even from a distance. I did it because I love you and wanted you to have the life I could never give you." He reached out to her, waiting for some sign of understanding, and after a moment of hesitation, Isabella took his hand, sealing a bond that could finally exist without barriers. The three remained in silence for what felt like an eternity. Isabella allowed the tears to flow, but they were tears of relief, finally finding an answer to the connection she had always felt with Miguel. She realized that, somehow, she had always known there was something special between them, something that transcended time and circumstances. Now, with the truth revealed, she felt whole, as if she had finally found her origin. Isabella's mother, who had been observing everything in silence, approached Miguel and touched his shoulder. She smiled serenely, almost resignedly, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for never abandoning us. For always being there, even when I wouldn't allow it." Miguel returned her look with a silent nod, acknowledging the shared understanding that now united them. With emotions still hanging in the air, Isabella stood and, wrapping her arms around Miguel and her father in a tight embrace, felt that she had finally found the family she had always longed for. No more secrets or facades, but now united by the truth and the love they had all quietly shared. In that moment, she knew that no matter how difficult the path had been, she would never be alone again. And that Miguel, as always, would be by her side, this time without needing to hide. With time, the mansion became a true home for everyone there, filled with laughter and moments that reflected a newfound unity. Since the revelation, Isabella felt she was finally part of a family that, although fragmented before, was now held together by bonds of love and honesty. She walked through the once cold corridors, which now seemed alive, illuminated by this new chapter of her life. Isabella knew that the emptiness she once felt in her heart had been filled with understanding and acceptance. Miguel, now officially part of the family, shared with Isabella the routines he had never imagined experiencing. They spent afternoons in the garden, where he would tell her stories of his youth, his adventures, and the mistakes that had taught him so much. She listened with fascination, absorbing every word, and over time she began to feel that, with him by her side, she had found her essence and her balance. For Miguel, these moments were the realization of a dream he had thought impossible. Between Isabella and her father, the conversations grew deeper and more genuine. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past and to be a present father, building a relationship of trust and affection that he had never had the chance to develop before. "I'm learning from you, Isabella," he would say, laughing as they shared confidences and conversations he once might have considered trivial. Isabella, who had once felt ignored, now saw in her father someone she could truly trust. In peace with his presence beside Isabella, Miguel felt that his role was finally complete. He had ceased to be the man in the shadows, the silent protector, to become her father in every sense of the word. Although they didn't need titles to feel close, Isabella affectionately called him her guardian angel, something he accepted with a shy but proud smile. They both knew that from then on, they would face the future together, openly and without reservations. Over the months, Miguel's relationship with Isabella's mother also stabilized. They didn't need to rekindle the love they once shared, but instead they respected and understood each other as friends who shared a past and a present in a calm and mature way. She thanked him for everything he had done, and in return Miguel promised to take care of Isabella and the family that, in a way, he had helped to build. Their mutual respect was enough for that story to find new meaning. The family, once a mosaic of scattered pieces, was now a complete portrait, where each person had found their place. Old pains and secrets had been left behind, and with that, there emerged a commitment to live a more honest and meaningful life. Isabella looked at her parents and at Miguel and felt secure, aware that the love they now shared was unbreakable. She knew that, regardless of what the future held, she would always have the strength of those around her. One quiet evening, as the family gathered on the veranda under a starry sky, Miguel turned to Isabella and took her hand. "I promise I'll always be by your side," he said, his eyes shining. Isabella, returning the gesture, squeezed his hand firmly, knowing she would never be alone again. Between them, there were no more secrets, only the unconditional love they had both waited so long to share. Isabella's father, watching the scene, felt the weight of the past finally lift. He knew that this peace had not been easy to achieve, but he was ready to enjoy every moment with his wife, his daughter, and Miguel, whom he now respected and considered part of the family. That night, as they shared laughter and stories under the stars, he realized that, despite everything, he had found the life he had always wanted, a life of truth and love. And so, amid the simplicity of an evening shared between the three of them, Miguel, Isabella, and her family allowed themselves to simply live. Without masks, without shadows. Only with the promise that, together, they could face anything. And in the end, the mansion, once the stage of so many secrets, had become the home where truth and love now reigned supreme. Life would go on, but with the certainty that, from then on, they would be unbreakable, a true family. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Isabella and Miguel, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional stories and would like to support our channel to help us continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting story.